Good morning, everybody. I was going to make a video last night, but I figured I'd wait. And I didn't have time to look at and read all these cases that I saw yesterday on the regular news, but I just watched it. And on the world news, I noticed I've been saying how bad world news is, which it is. They're not covering stuff that they should cover. But CBS is okay with Scott Pelley. It's a little better coverage. And PBS, of course, I think is okay. It's some of the stuff you heard me comment on. But ABC is terrible. You could have a nuclear attack. You could have, and the top news would be something about Trump's daughter. So but CBS, here it's Channel 10. Last night on the world news, just watching the news, they had a case of a man that was freed from, it was a cold case file of a girl that was murdered in Illinois. Now, I didn't review any of these. This is just me watching, so I think the cases are correct. I might have city wrong or something in the things I'm just going to quote right now. But she was murdered in Illinois back in the 50s. I read a little bit online too, but for many years it was an unsolved case. And when they finally solved the case of this little girl's murder, it was one of the oldest cold case files where they actually solved. Okay. Well, this was world news yesterday. His name was McCullough, and he had just gotten released. He did multiple years in prison. And then it looks strange, like the Stephen Avery case. And I just read, I Googled, the name, I forget who killed the girl's name. And there was a site, a blog, WordPress blog, which I have a WordPress blog, as well as the main blog on Blogger, Google. And I'm assuming that they've been writing about this case ever since this man's been in jail. But the man who has that blog, I'm not sure who it is, I noticed he said, this blog has not been updated since the most recent release of this man by the name of McCullough. I believe he was a cop, an officer, retired. And he was 70 or whatever when they convicted him. But the blog simply showed all of the evidence that the FBI, the cops, and the prosecutors had already, and yet they still convicted him. The evidence that they already had on this man was that he was innocent. But they thought they still had enough, even though they knew he was innocent. They thought they still had enough to get the conviction. That's very sad. The day of the murder in Illinois, the reason he was under suspicion was because he did live in that area back in the 50s. But the day of the murder, the time of the murder, he was on a bus, and I believe he was in Rockford, joining the military. And he actually joined the military that day. They had evidence that he was in. There was newspaper clippings and all. It was impossible for him to have committed the crime. But when they brought this older man in when he was in the 70s in for the interview, the cold case murder back in the 50s, they said he was nervous. And he was, he went in for the interview. He told them, no, I had joined the military. Maybe he was under suspicion back in the 50s. And he said, and they had all the proof that the day he had enlisted, he was not in town. They had all that. But they still thought they had enough where, even though they knew he didn't do it, they were not. They thought they still had enough inconsistencies in other statements he made that they could get a conviction. Now, on the world news last night, you watched the date of this video. This was last night, yesterday. The judge that released him said, they just released him. They said new evidence has come to light and he's innocent. But according to the blog, they had that already. And a new judge did come in, a new prosecutor and all. And when they looked at it, I'm sure they realized, we knew this guy was innocent all along. And that judge and new prosecutor probably realized, oh, the other prosecutor knew he was a knifeong. He purposely pursued for his own political means. Okay. Now, on the same news, World News with Scott Pelley, CBS, they had a cop, a young white cop, the story went back a ways, who arrested a black man. And the black man and the white cop now, they had on interviewed. But the white cop, this was World News now, he walked up to the black man and said, I'm going to bust your ass. Now, did he say, you effing nigger? Who knows? But the white cop said to the black guy, I'm going to get you on a drug deal right now. The black guy told him, what are you talking about? I'm not selling, I'm doing nothing like that. The cop said, it make no difference. I need an arrest today. You're going to prison. Now, the black guy did 4 years, telling his lawyer, his court-appointed lawyer, telling the judge, this cop came up to me and said, I need a drug arrest. Was he telling the truth? Yes, the black man was telling the truth. And the cop admitted it. Now, when they showed you when he was doing these arrests, he made multiple arrests like that over a few years. He was like a little smart-ass kid. You could see his picture. He was walking up to black people. This was World News. This came out. They did it, the whole thing on it. And he just said, I'm going to get your black ass. Oh, John, did he use those terms? What's the difference whether he used the terms? He did that, and he admitted it. And he'd walk up to them. You're going to jail today. Now, finally, and what I want you to see is within civilian departments, oftentimes, the chiefs of those departments, the supervisors of those departments, oftentimes are fully aware of felonies that are committed by their fellow officers. And the way they deal with those things is you need to slow up on the assaults of minors. You need to slow up on killing people in the back of your cop car. You need to slow up on the public is not aware that oftentimes the chiefs of these departments, when these allegations of their own officers committing felonies after felonies after felonies after felonies, that they're aware of that. And oftentimes the families that are victims by these cops are retaliated against. So, on the news last night, the reason they did the story is the white cop admitted, and in the interview, he's no longer an officer, but in the interview, he did 1.5 years in jail. Finally, after multiple walking up to black people, you're going to jail. I pick you, I pick you, I pick you. He admitted, and they asked him, they said, why did you do that? He says, I just, I wanted to build up. He admitted it all. Now, the black man's a Christian. And they wound up both getting out of jail. The black man did 4 years. But how many other black men did he do that to? Multiple of maybe 70 years, of 4 years, 8 years, 6 years. Just he said he was doing it ever since day one, the cop admitted. But the cop only did 1.5 years. We should have a federal law that when you're busted doing that shit, you have to do every single year that you framed those black people for. Why didn't you pick white people? So they both work at a faith-based ministry. And they had the little interview on the news. It's supposed to show reconciliation. And they said the black man saw the white cop at that. They're both working at like a ministry thing, got a job. And the white cop said, just told him, I'm sorry. And the black man forgave. And now the black man was a Christian. And then when they ended that story, Scott Pelley and said, see, everything's better now. So, no, the problem is that goes on every single day. True investigative reporting would say, I wonder why they're allowed to commit felonies ongoing in your city, my city. with the full acknowledgement. Why? Then I watched the documentary that I mentioned the other day. It finally came on. I caught it last night, and it's a ESPN documentary, 30 by 30. They covered the Duke lacrosse team. Now, I could have reread it to get all of the, but I watched it, so it's fresh in my memory. Now, the Duke lacrosse team was at Duke University. Now, I believe it's Durham, North Carolina, okay? I believe that's where it is, because I'm remembering. But it showed how these sports players for Duke University, which is, considered a very high-class university, how the sports players hired 2 strippers to come to a party, and they paid them like $800 to come to the party. They only stayed for like 10 minutes and said, we're taking off, and they called, an online escort agency number or whatever, that's how they got it. And the guys were mad, they were yelling at them, and they were using racial slurs as they were leaving the house. And the one girl, now, she is also, I think, a victim in this. Her name is Crystal Magnus, a pretty girl. Pretty black girl, pretty eyes. And they had her in this documentary. They had the church she used to attend. And the black woman minister of the church said, oh, Crystal was a sweet girl, but she had many problems. Now, the Crystal, the black stripper, that is a very famous case, okay, Duke University case, with Mike Nifong, another criminal, prosecutor, absolute criminal. Paul says in the book of Romans, this is a doctrine actually, some debate the doctrines of sovereignty and predestination. Some debate whether there's something called double predestination, because the Apostle Paul says there were vessels of wrath fitted for destruction. What if God, willing to show his wrath and then to reveal his mercy on the chosen, the elect, what if he allowed those that were predestined for hell or wrath, vessels of wrath fitted for destruction, book of Romans? What if he, now, I don't teach that doctrine the way the classic Calvinists teach it, meaning I don't believe God created people just so one day they'd burn forever in hell so he could be glorified. But in this case, maybe God would make a wonderful exception and allow Mike Nifong to be in that category of burning forever after a million, billion, the classic doctrine of hell. I don't want to do the different views Christians have held. But wouldn't it be a wonderful thing for Mr. Nifong to burn for 1 billion years and after screaming his brains out, because he's a criminal. He's a prosecutor. You have criminals in every level. There was enough cases here. I could have gone through them. All of these cases now in our local Nueces County, they're all getting overturned, these murder cases. And they're all coming back here, and they're not getting retried. And some of those cases, it was quite obvious that the Hannah Overton case is now going to be a documentary, which they're going to do it. Just read this yesterday. Hannah Overton was a Christian missionary who was going to adopt Andrew Bird. I'm just going to talk a little. But anyway, in her case, the boy got sick, and she took him to the hospital. The boy died. Well, they accused Hannah Overton, who was a missionary, a Christian missionary, goes to church here. Rodfield Road is where the church was. But she basically said the boy he ate, and there was witnesses that the boy had a disease called pica, which meant he used to pick things out of the trash and eat. He'd eat anything he could. So, and the reason this was important, it seems as if the boy was diagnosed with this sickness, which would have explained key evidence that they used to get Hannah, Mark Skirka, DA. Because in the trial, they said she poisoned that kid by forcing him to drink water with Cajun seasoning in the water. And that's why he might have died. Now, even if that happened, they did not, she said that she used to just give him the Cajun seasoning because he always had a ravenous appetite, possibly because he had this disease called pica. which is an eating disorder, which would explain sodium levels in his blood. Now, all of this came out, and one of the doctors that they used here in Oasis County Court to testify, Mark Skirka prosecuting her, one of the doctors, they used his testimony openly, publicly, saying that, and that doctor had to come out and say, no, they're lying. I never said that. The doctor himself. You had case after case after case here where other people that were testifying against, they came out in court and said, they asked me to frame this friend. In court, this came out. That, I believe the name of that kid is Gatan, and they said, we're going to frame him. And wait a minute, you had one of the other guys who testified in a criminal case. That one's is in the process of getting overturned. And they stood up in court and said, the DA and his prosecutors asked me to frame my friend. He shouted it out in court because he knew if he said it any other time, they'd go after that kid, possibly. So that came out in court. That was his only chance to say it. And I remember they interviewed one of the prosecutors from the DA's office. And you would think he would have denied it. No, we didn't ask him to frame his friend. They said, well, yeah, sort of like that, but not exactly how he said it. These are... So, Mike Nifong and the Duke lacrosse team, and this documentary I watched, you should watch it. It's called Fantastic Lives, and it's an ESPN documentary. I just caught it on Netflix. When this black stripper, Crystal Magnus or something like that, when she came and made the accusation, Mike Nifong was running for re-election, and it showed in the documentary how he's running, and he's given... I remember watching the news back at this time when this happened. I thought the kids were guilty too. But he's on TV saying, we got a case. He's enjoying it. He gave, many interviews, hundreds of interviews. No prosecutor normally does that. Well, the campaign manager on the documentary, who was running his re-election campaign, she was saying, what are you doing? This is campaign manager. He said, look at all the free press I'm getting, he told her. He basically said, I'm pursuing this because I'm getting all this free press, and I need to keep my job. And if I got to basically keep it just to destroy all these, both the victim and the girl who made the accusation, I'll destroy whoever I got to destroy. Because what counts in my career as a prosecutor is not justice. What counts is how I can be a criminal and accomplish my goals. Now, obviously, he didn't say it, but that's what he was doing. And his campaign manager eventually quit because he kept pursuing. And in the documentary, the reason many of the reporters and all during the case believed in the guilt of these boys, and it showed you how when she went in and they were doing they showed the pictures of the lineup, just the pictures. And she said there were 3, but she had made this up. Came out now. And they said, well, we need 3. And the people she picked, you couldn't really tell what they looked like. One of them's name was Finnerty, I think Colin Finnerty, the lacrosse guys. The other one is Siegelman, I forget the name of the other one, Evans or something. But he had like a baby face. But if you looked at him, just not by the picture, he was actually a pretty muscular, tall kid, very tall. But he looked like a baby-faced kid. But when she gave the descriptions of the people that supposedly had raped her in the restroom of that party, the descriptions of these kids were nothing like who she said raped her. But they were making her pick out 3 pictures. They needed pictures. So she picks 3. And it's very sad. But the cop, there's a cop in the case, I forget his name, they kept showing you his picture. You could just see how corrupt that cop was. They had pictures of him. But the cop, when he got the so-called, from her statements of the men who had sexually assaulted her, what he did was when he wrote up the report, he lied and wrote descriptions that had nothing to do with the descriptions that she initially gave of who these lacrosse players that assaulted her. So he just changed it, and he just looked at the Colin Finnerty, who had like a baby face, and he lied, the cop, and she said he looked like a baby face, but he just lied. Now that cop, you could see, they were all criminals, and he committed suicide a few years ago. So that cop is burning, glorifying God, because he was engulfed with iniquity and sin. He killed himself, that cop. Mike Nifong continued to carry the prosecution, and as you watch a documentary, he knew those boys were innocent. And then they had a DNA, but because there was no DNA found, and the state's DNA lab found no DNA of those boys at all. So he hired a personal, the prosecutor went and did not use the results from his own state crime lab and hired a private crime lab to do their own DNA. Normally defenses do this because they don't trust the state's crime lab. But in this case, Mike Nifong went and hired a private lab. So, in the private lab, they found one thing. They were just looking for one. They had to have a third person that they could charge. So they said, find something. And they made up evidence. This came out in court in the documentary. And one of the defense team for the lacrosse kids, he stayed up a week. He knew nothing about DNA evidence, like as an expert, but he read a book. He said, well, I need to brush up on it. He read that whole book in 1 week, showed all the various details. And he realized, as when he informed himself, that the girl, Crystal, she had DNA on her. She was basically an escort service for multiple men from her job previous before showing up at the party. There was a lot of male DNA on her and in her. A lot. From many, many men. And none of those men were from the Duke lacrosse team. He saw that, the lawyer. And then he figured out that they purposefully planned to not reveal any of that DNA evidence. And they were lying. But Mike Nifong, the prosecutor, figured that the lawyers would not be ready to defend something like that. He figured he wouldn't be caught, that they were criminals, just faking stuff. And so they had a hearing at the court there in Durham, North Carolina. Famous case. They're all protesting, these lacrosse kids who were innocent. And at the hearing, the lawyer, they had the DNA guy there. And Mike Nifong figured out they won't be able to read and figure out all this DNA. But they went ahead and told one of the lawyers, the defense team said to one of the younger lawyers who read that book on DNA, they said, you need to challenge him right now because this is our chance. And he admitted on the stand, the DNA guy, he admitted that the prosecutor, they showed you the face of Mike Nifong, said, hide all this other evidence. Just show stuff. Don't let them know the truth. So he basically went out, hired a private lab in order to get around the fact that the boys were innocent. Mike Nifong finally gets disbarred, loses his license, and does 1 day in jail. Destroyed those kids. But what it showed you was it shows you that we're at a level in cops. None of these are just one-time incidents. These are simply the ones that finally you see. This is happening every single day in the country. All of the cases, I didn't read them all. I got a lot of papers there here that are getting overturned. There's enough evidence here that has gone on. You had public newspaper reports of crimes committed here by the DA's office, and all these cases came out. Lying witnesses, all of it. And this just keeps going on. Just keeps going on. Almost like, please don't do it again. Please don't, commit felonies. Please try not to commit felonies anymore. Okay, Nifong, McCullough, and, Austin, a little update on Jimmy D. He's going to get back into the program. Charlie's Place, and he's going to try and get back on his feet again. And Jimmy, he was in jail for that month. I mentioned that on the other video. Let me say, at the end of the video with Jude and David and Pops, David has PTSD because David had open heart surgery, died on the table. This was a few years ago. I went and prayed with him that day. Me and his brothers went. Me and Andy went to the hospital a few years ago. But he had PTSD, stress and all, and so he's been on the prescriptions for a long time. And I felt he had a problem with that. I wrote him a nice letter a few years ago. I said, I love you, brother, but you got something with all the prescriptions you're on. But anyway, they're cutting him off a lot of those prescriptions. And so I could see he had a lot of anxiety, like panic attack. So when we're done with the video, I got to lay down, John. He laid down, and I took Pops after the little meeting. But I just went in the room and prayed for David and quoted the scripture, let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. And peace be with you. And because I could see, I used to have those, not in the last 5-year experiences. I had other mental things, but years ago I had a lot of, anxiety attacks and stuff. And so I just wanted to mention Jimmy's going to get in the program. I had another good talk with Austin. He came by. Let me just see if there's various things I've been reading. I like this one in the book of Hosea. Come and let us return unto the Lord, for he has torn and he will heal us. He has smitten and he will bind us up. After 2 days will he revive us, and in the 3rd day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight. And that's so prophetic of the gospel, because we also, obviously, Christ himself as the sign of Jonah. As Jonah was in the belly of the whale, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth. He'll be buried, and on the 3rd day rise again. And so as the corporate community of God, this is a reference to the restoration of Israel as well as the Israel of God. But after 2 days, we'll be in the grave, if you will. I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And Paul will teach in the New Testament, I have been crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I. Let no man glory except in the cross. We are so identified with Christ. So even though this prophecy is like a corporate prophecy for the community of Israel, applied to all the new creation in heaven and earth, and there's a verse in Ephesians that says, and a lot of times people misunderstand this verse, but it says Jesus, in the New Testament, it says he nailed up this one, I think it's in Colossians. He took the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was the law, which was condemnation, and he nailed it to his cross. And in Ephesians it says he reconciled both unto God through his body, meaning Jew and Gentile. Sometimes that verse is misunderstood, but he took the law out of the way, the enmity, nailing it to his cross, so both Jew and Gentile, all races, if you will, now today, can have access to the Father by one Spirit. So even though this little verse, I was going to teach this much on it, says, the 3rd day he will revive us. It's corporately our identification in Christ. He will raise us up and we shall live in his sight. And Paul says in Ephesians, we are seated together in heavenly places in Christ. And we're there. We're there. But look what it says in the next verse. I guess this will be the verse for this mood. Then shall we know, this is Hosea 6, the first 3 verses. Then shall we know, if we follow on to know the Lord. His going forth is prepared as the morning. He shall come unto us as the rain. Then shall we know, if we follow on to know the Lord. And Paul in the New Testament says that over and over again. He says, you are now identified, but now walk in the Spirit. Having begun, Galatians, having begun in the Spirit, are you now made perfect by the flesh? Christ has been evidently set forth. He was telling the Galatians, you now have this experience to know the Father through the Son. And if you regress back to the law, this is the heresy of Judaism, which were the Jewish believers, who according to the council in Acts 15, continued in that first century to practice circumcision and so forth, but the Gentile believers were not going to go under that law. But then you had groups that were going around to Paul's churches or communities that he was establishing in the gospel, and they were convincing those Christians, Gentile Christians, to get circumcised, come under the law, and Paul fights against that. He says, no, you started well, who did hinder you? And Paul will say that in the letter of Galatians, which I'm also reading. So if we go on to know the Lord, I had a good talk with I haven't had them all on video, but one of the kids, one of my guys I work with, and I said, no, we're actually walking in this experience with God right now. A lot of these kids have a lot of insights. But I said, we're in the kingdom now. We're in the kingdom now. Some of them will be telling me, John, it's like I'm with all the problems they have. They say it's like I'm experiencing, supernatural things, and God is real. I said, yes, the kingdom of heaven is now. Austin said that last night or the other day. I didn't do a video with that. He said, but the kingdom of heaven, John, is right now. I said, yes, it is. It's very real. It's here now, and there's obviously a future reality to it. And maybe let me just comment. I like that one from Hosea. I'll try and add that because we went 31 minutes. This is Galatians 6. If a man be overtaken in a fault, you which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself lest thou also be tempted. Jesus says before you can remove the big thing out of your brother's eye, the little thing out of your brother's eye, take the beam out of your own eye. God wants correction. He doesn't want us to just overlook things, but we have to be walking in righteousness. I was upset watching the end of that show on CBS News, because at the end, even though that black man made reconciliation with that white cop, they played it off as, see, everything's better now. Can't we all get along? No. You should have followed through with explaining this is an endemic problem. It's an endemic problem. That's a percentage of it going on every single day in this country. Okay. Let every man prove his own work, and then shall have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. For every man shall bear his own burden. God forbid that I should glory save in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom the world is crucified unto me, and I unto the world, separated from the world. I like this one. From henceforth let no man trouble me, for I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Paul says, don't bother me anymore. Paul says over and over again, he says, I'm ready to depart. I'm ready to be offered as a sacrifice. And as you read that, you think he was telling the truth, that he recognized everything that was going to take place with him in his life. And he says at the end of that letter, don't bother me no more. Let every man prove his own. Every man will bear his own burden. There's a scripture that says, when people are in judgment and suffering and difficulty, they bear that alone. I wrote part of that out here. It says, but also, when you finally come to a place in God, it says, a stranger, that's Proverbs, a stranger will not intermeddle with his joy. So the same experience that you have when you're going through a lot of problems, you bear that alone, and the world goes on. And when those black guys are sitting in jail, because the white cop said, today I will bust niggers, and they bear that alone. But then there comes a time in renewal that when you finally get back a hold of God, you learned how to be alone. You learned how to be alone. You learned how it's not really all about this excitement of, building a ministry. You learned how to be alone. Jesus said, even though he was walking alone at times, he says, nevertheless, I am not alone because the Father is with me. There's a prophecy that there come a time where every one of his friends would forsake him. They would turn their face. They would say, oh, nothing to do with him. He says, but I am not alone because the Father is with me. And Paul ends that great little letter to the Galatians. He says, don't bother me. He says, leave me alone. He says, I bear my body. He says, I'm now on track again. I don't want to get to all these other, things. Jesus said the Pharisees, that they had all this excitement in their religious activities. And it was so exciting to just be religiously involved and recognized as ministers, and long prayers and all the things and the phylacteries. And there was something that, they were excited about, being in that trade of religion. And Paul is saying, I'm identifying with I have marks in me. I bear in my body marks. Don't bother me no more. That's what he said. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. God bless.